Welcome to our 7th annual Writers Symposium by the Sea at Point Loma Nazarene University. I'm Dean Nelson of the journalism faculty at the university, and with us tonight is Kathleen Norris, who has written such deep spiritual books as Dakota, Amazing Grace, The Cloister Walk, and her most recent, as she calls, the racy book, The Virgin of Bennington. Her books of poetry include Little Girls in Church, The Middle of the World, and Falling Off. And she is also editor of the most recent edition of Best American Essays for 2001. Kathleen Norris, welcome to our Writers Symposium by the Sea.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Why don't we start by talking about you as a poetry writer as a high school girl. You said in one of your books that you wrote poetry as a self-defense, as a protective coloration, you said. It was so full of depressing things because of your hypersensitivity to yourself. Is that as good a place to start writing poetry as any?
I think that's where a lot of people, start to write. And I sometimes will hear from young writers, especially high school writers, who say, why can I only write when I'm depressed? And I'll say, because that it's not a discipline yet. It's just, this exploration that you're doing. And, you have to have an identity in high school. And if it isn't a jock, which in my case it definitely wasn't, I was good in music and good in English and lousy in math. And so you sort of find your way through and you say, well, I'll write poetry because that's something that the football players aren't doing. And I'll work for for the school literary magazine and do those sorts of things. And that's how I certainly found my way through high school.
But then something happened when you were at Bennington, where later on you write that you began to read and write poetry as if your life depended on it. What happened there? Well,
and actually some of that was a little after college, because in the college atmosphere it was still easy to write poetry and actually have people willing to read it. Your professors are paid to do this sort of thing. It's incredible, because when you get out into the real world or the workaday world, it's sort of hard to come by. And so I think I realized that about my writing, that it really was something I needed to do so desperately. When I didn't have to write it anymore, I wasn't in college, but I would spend my weekends in Manhattan. I'd go to my office and work, because it was very quiet there, no one would call me, and I had a IBM Selectric typewriter. That's how long ago it was. But I had a fancy typewriter. I could really type up these poems. And there are other things you could do with Saturdays in Manhattan, but it didn't occur to me. This is what I needed to do, to make my little cell there in my office and go to work.
Well, connected to that, you had said in that statement that I had read earlier, you said you discovered that poetry became a way of life. And what does that mean? How does poetry become a way of life?
Well, it sounds very romantic, but I think it really does come down to habit, habitual, that this is something that you're going to be doing on days when you don't feel like doing it. On days when it doesn't make sense, nothing comes, you're still going to be plugging away, knowing that you are a poet, you are a writer, this is what you do, even when it's not working. It's really a habit. And I think that's really the only difference between me and people who aren't writers. That we all have incredible life stories. Incredible things have happened to us, and some very ordinary things, but love, birth, death, divorce, whatever is going on. There's real incredible stories out there, but I'm in the habit of writing them down. My own and other people's stories, and that is the difference. And Bennington, for all of its shortcomings, it's really the most secular environment in this country. I was reminded today from one of your faculty has a master's in writing degree from Bennington, and they pride themselves on being a campus without a gym and without a chapel. I mean, this is a matter of pride to them. But one of the great things they did for me, and they do for a number of budding artists, is that the English faculty there are all writers. When I was there, it was Bernard Malamud, the novelist, Ben Bellett, the poet, a number of other people, and the art faculty are pretty well-known painters. And so you have an exposure to people who have really made this their life. It is their way of life, and art as not something you study, not something you go to museums to see, but as people are living, doing it.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned just a moment ago about writers write it down, everybody experiences the same things, but writers write it down. Is that the fundamental difference between writers and everybody else?
Well, and writers make something of it. This morning in chapel I was talking about, something that I know is coming. It's a poem that I can feel. I haven't really felt a poem coming like this for quite some time, but standing in the post office, the downtown post office, and thinking about the second law of thermodynamics, because everybody's faces are sagging, the people are anxious and worried, and the second law of thermodynamics is that basically everything is falling apart. Which, when you reach middle age, that becomes a very personal statement. Or even if you suffer something like a sports injury, it goes on your permanent record. The broken bones show up. If you live to be 100, that broken bone is still going to show up on an X-ray. So it's making something out of the ordinary, I guess, is the real difference. Not just writing it down, but trying to see something that's there beyond the surface, sort of hidden.
Okay. Now, you talk a lot in your books about metaphor and the importance of metaphor in everything. In fact, I read one article about you that said you were a metaphor.
Could be.
That was a new status, I thought.
Pinch me.
So why is this so important? Why is, in your estimation, why is metaphor so important? Why can't things just be what they are?
Well, they are what they are, but I also think metaphor is the way we think. We think by making comparisons, and you see a small child, you know a pickle tastes one way, ice cream tastes another, they're both cold, so you have to make up ways to think about them, and there are some comparisons, but there are also differences, and that's how we really learn, and how we think about just about everything sort of comes to us through our senses. But I think of metaphors. Maybe I won't read a whole poem, but I'm going to read something from a mathematician, because you think of mathematicians and metaphor. I mean, this is not what they think of, but I think of metaphors the way Riemann thought about numbers. He said, "I did not invent those pairs of differential equations. I found them in the world where God had hidden them." And I feel that's a writer's job, is to find the metaphors that are there. Often they're part of the natural world. They're signs in the natural world. And somehow I'm going to pull them together and make something of it. But God has put it there. I haven't invented a metaphor. It's not my invention. It's not my creativity that's done it. It's really something God has placed there in the world, and I see it and go, aha. And that's, whether I'm really dealing with an actual metaphor or not, that sort of aha moment is always where the writing comes from.
When did you start thinking of yourself as a writer? I'm thinking of a time in one of your books where you talk about a teacher accusing you of plagiarism because it was written so well.
Oh, yes.
And was that a moment where you just thought, I must be a writer?
In fact, that was one of the few people I've named in my book, because I thought that was such a wonderful teaching moment. It was, I believe, for my freshman year of high school, and I'd been kind of an indifferent student. I really was bogged down by mathematics, and kind of a frustrated student for so long. And this teacher, I forget what the assignment was now. It's funny, but it was one of the first assignments in English class that I'd had in a long time that really interested me. And so I really did a lot of research. I worked really hard on the paper, and then I handed it in. I was all excited, and she said, she just basically accused me of plagiarism, and I was so stunned. And then my parents called her, and they said, well, we saw her work on this, and she was so excited about it. And the teacher's reaction was, well, that's fine. It's just that she hasn't done anything this good. Well, now if she can keep it up, then I'll believe her. A brilliant
There's
teacher,
some pressure.
Miss Gertrude Ellis in my 9th grade at Poona House School in about 1961. But yeah, if she can keep this up, you've got to keep doing this now. Now, if you want to demonstrate that you did this on your own. Well, that really was the easy part for me. But it also really helped me see that this was something I wanted to do.
And so, were there other crystallizing moments where you said, this is what I am? I know one person who said, I knew I was a writer when I got an advance for a book that was in 6 figures. But not until then did she
I'm
really
not a
consider...
writer.
Well,
If that's the standard, I'm still not a writer.
I'm just wondering what the standard is. I know that's what this one was. What's yours? How do you know?
I think that sense that I was still doing this when I didn't have any reason to. I mean, beyond school, you know, and I had also, one of the things I talk about, because I really talk about my origins as a poet in The Virgin of Bennington, when I said to a poet in New York that I met, and I said, you know, I have this collection of poems, a stack of poems that are building, and I'm noticing that some of the poems I'm writing now, this is maybe 2 years out of college, are connected to some poems I wrote my senior year, you know, and she said, well, maybe what you have isn't just a stack of poems, it's a book. And that was a thunderbolt. That was an absolutely life-changing experience because I realized I was working on a book. I hadn't recognized that before, and that gave me the courage to enter a manuscript competition, and I won $500 for my first book of poems. I mean, 3 figures. I thought that was pretty good.
It's more than these students got earlier tonight.
Yeah. Oh, I have nieces, my nieces and nephew, and they just think it's incredible that I get paid for writing book reports. Like if I write a book review or something, you get paid for your book reports.
Now you have talked about how important storytelling is to every culture, and it has been important to civilization from the very beginning. One of the things you said was that we learn our ways of being and reinforce our values by telling tales of each other. I read that and I thought, don't we also write to challenge those values and challenge our ways of being? Can't writing and storytelling do both?
Oh, I hope writing and storytelling does both, and I think that's one of the great joys of a reader, when you recognize that you're being challenged. And I think that especially happens when you're when you're reading a book and you don't especially like the characters. You know, they're either sleazy people or they're mean or something's going on and you really don't like them, but you have to keep reading the book. You have to find out what happens to these people. And maybe you understand why they're so mean, or maybe you don't. Maybe they just seem irredeemable to you, and bad things happen to them, and you're glad. I mean, but you get all emotionally involved with this, and you think, yes, they got their just desserts, and this happened to this poor person. That, you know, to sort of something redemptive happened here. I think that's really the joy of being the reader, and I love writing that will do that will engage me in that way. So even if I don't particularly like what's happening in a book, I want to keep going in it because I have to find out what the writer has done here, what's happened, if there is a redemptive quality, or not, if something's just falling flat and it seems sort of falling in on itself. I mean, it's interesting to me to see what the writer is doing.
Well, you talk about storytelling in some of your books about almost a primal nature that we have to tell stories. You say we get air, and we get water, and we get some food, and we tell stories.
That's it. That's the basic. I think it really is. I mean, I can't imagine human beings that don't tell stories on themselves and other people. And of course, I have a whole chapter in Dakota about the holy use of gossip. And a lot of people, you know, gossip is horrible. It's unholy, but as a writer, I love to go back and look at the etymologies of words. And the word gossip originally came into our language as meaning a godparent, someone who was present at a baptism. So in a couple of hundred years, it went from having a religious meaning to meaning something very unholy and even a sin. So how did that happen? And is there a holy use for gossip? And looking at it as a writer, and I think as someone who's addicted to gossip and stories, I think there is a good use for gossip. It's like a lot of the good gifts we've been given. When we misuse it, bad things happen, but there is, and I think what I'd said in the book, and living in a small town, that lots of times people will get up on Sunday morning in this church, the Presbyterian church there, and they'll tell stories about what needs to be prayed over during the week, and it really is a form of gossip, but it's holy gossip, and it's basically to help us pray better. So we'll know that so-and-so's getting divorced and his mother-in-law's real upset, or we'll hear much more detail than we really want sometimes about medical problems, but, you know.
We call that an organ recital.
Yeah, just about. But people, you know, I really think of that as the Holy Spirit working. These people who are often very reticent and very private, this is the one space that they will tell these things. And it's okay if you get on the phone and tell somebody else from another church that you need to pray for so-and-so because they're going in for surgery Wednesday and they're really scared about it or something. There is a way to use storytelling so it's gossip in the good sense and not the bad sense.
One of the things you also have said about writing stories is that you write sometimes things that you yourself don't comprehend, which I found to be an interesting statement, and so it made me wonder, is that why you write, is to comprehend? I
think so. And I think I'm very good at discovering what something means long after I've written it. And I think that's true. I mean, writing is a prophetic calling in a certain way. I mean, I'm not going to call myself a prophet and say I can tell the future, or compare myself to Isaiah. This is not what I do. But I know it's prophetic in the sense that I go back and I read something I wrote 10 years before, and all of a sudden it has a whole new meaning because of everything that's gone on in my life in the last 10 years. And I think if any of you keep journals, I think you go back 10 years before and you know a lot about what's happening now that you didn't realize then. You know, there are really deep connections. I think it's the unconscious at work, perhaps the Holy Spirit, maybe a little imagination thrown into the pot. There's a lot of hidden mystery, I think, in the whole process of writing and revealing. And like I was telling people at dinner tonight, I wrote 3 books. It wasn't until the 3rd book was in my hand, The Amazing Grace, that I realized I had been working on a trilogy all along. And it's that sort of coming to awareness very suddenly, but it's been building and growing for quite some time, in this case about 10 years. But it wasn't until I held the book, I said, I wrote a trilogy. And then it all fell into place.
Well, you mentioned imagination. Let's talk about that for a minute. Can you cultivate an imagination in your view? I know you've written some things about where imagination really comes alive, and it doesn't have much to do with inspiration.
I mean, it has something. I think inspiration does exist, but I think turning off the television is a great way to stimulate the imagination. I mean, it really matters. It makes a difference in your attention span, because you're not waiting for the next commercial. You know, you watch small children in television, and you'll see how much the rhythm of the TV has an effect on them. Turning off the TV, getting as much silence as you can, some solitude, a number of things will feed the imagination. Reading good books, listening to music, looking at paintings, something that sort of takes you out of yourself, and then you get yourself back. I think that's, in a sense, how imagination works. Bread baking is one of my tools. If I want to think about things, sometimes I'll start a loaf of bread in the morning and knead the dough and just go through this whole process of baking bread. And sometimes while that bread is rising, I'll actually sit and get some creative time out of that.
What about perseverance? Well,
perseverance is the other thing. I mean, it's fine to have some inspiration, but if you want to create a work of art, that's the toil, that's the sweat, you know, that's sitting with it and working on it perhaps for years, you know, before you're ready to let it go. And so that's the part where and the imagination is working all along. I mean, the last revision that you make to this thing 3 years after you started may be the best thing you've done to it. It may be the finishing touch. So the imagination is at work in the process all along. And I don't know, I think you can cultivate it, you can try to do the things that aren't going to shut the imagination down. You know, drugs, alcohol, TV, I don't know, fast cars. No, I like fast cars. But, you know, for everyone it's an individual thing. You have to sort of make those choices. What is distracting me from the solitude and the silence I need, and what is promoting the imaginative work that I want to do?
You know, you mentioned silence, the role of silence, and in fact you had even said at one point that that silence, poetry and silence leads you to a state of being in which you do not need words at all. That's the root of poetry. But if you don't need words and you're a poet, how can that not be a contradiction?
Oh, I love contradictions. Where would we be without contradictions? I guess it is a contradiction, and a good one, because it's a life-giving one. I was talking to Frederica this morning or this afternoon, telling her about going to an Orthodox worship service for the first time. And for me as a poet, I can get so hung up on words that not being able to understand the words, it was in Old Slavonic, not being able to understand the words was a positive thing for me. It made me really pay attention to what goes on in worship, not just up here, but with the whole body. So I think there's you know, poets are going to play around with words, but there's also those what the artist would call negative space, the silences between the words. And if the words come slowly, or they come really hard sometimes, you begin to respect that they're coming out of silence. They're not coming out of myself and my flighty imagination. There's something deeper going on. So silence tends to remind us of that, of the sort of the deeper bass tones or something. It's the deeper reality that we're really living in. And we tend to forget it. We get distracted and do a lot of other things.
Here's a quote from Dakota that I want to know, how does writing address this, this quote? "We don't tend to see the truth as something that could set us free, because it means embracing pain, acknowledging our differences and conflicts, taking our real situation into account." You wrote that in Dakota. How can writing confront that kind of truth that we're so committed to avoiding?
Well, I just think, you know, it presents itself, and you take up the challenge or not as a reader. I think as a writer, again, you're working with your unconscious, you know, you're dealing with all your own fears and everything, and as you let those fears sort of fall away and address truths more directly, it's amazing how liberating it can be. Like discovering what's really been going on in my life in a memoir, it's incredible. I mean, I make a discovery, and then the challenge is to say, okay, I have to communicate this to a reader who may or may not believe in Christ, who may or may not, you know, share my interest in the Dakotas, who may or may not, you know, be my age, my generation, whatever. But you try to open it up for that reader too, so they'll see, oh, I know what that discovery feels like in my life, and it was like this. But to kind of open it up that way.
Do you have a writing schedule that you try to keep to?
I know when my best time to write is, and that's when I first get up in the morning, very early. I mean, sometimes it's as early as 3:30 or 4 if I'm really fired up and working on a specific project. So my job as a writer is to try not to fill that time with things like making coffee, there's a gym I like to go to in the morning too, so to sort of balance it, you know, to just knowing that that's my best writing time. And my writing schedule when I'm actually finishing a book is pretty much almost 8 to 10 hours a day to really push through and do work, and especially when you get down to copy editing, which is kind of like water torture. You know, it becomes pretty much literally a full-time job.
And in that schedule, can you write intensely for a couple of hours, then have to take off for a little while, and then you come back to it, or do you just have, other than those big 8 to 10 hour pushes, have you just got a couple of good hours a day, or are you the kind of person who can write?
If I'm really bad, it's a good 20 minutes or half an hour. I mean, if it's really coming very, very slowly, or some days I sacrifice. I say, okay, this day I am doing this for some other people, maybe something at the church, maybe something. My husband's an invalid right now. I'm taking care of him. There are other things where I know I'm going to spend most of the day at the doctor's office, so I'm going to try to really make the most of this time in the morning. So sometimes, oddly enough, those other things sometimes intensify the writing period that I have because it's so precious, that I know I need to do it then from maybe 4 to 6 in the morning because the rest of the day is shot for the purposes of writing. But then sometimes during that period of when I'm busy and active and doing other things, the unconscious and the imagination are at work in me. So at the end of the day, when I'm really, really tired at 6 or 7 at night, you know, I'm going to go change that word. I'm going to go in this direction here. I've got another idea to work with this, how I'm going to do this. So by the next morning I get up and I'm really fired up because I've both worked in the morning and I've also let the work sort of work in me during the day without even thinking about it, not even consciously thinking about it, which I think is marvelous. I like the image that Jesus has, the farmer, you know, the seed grows in the ground and the farmer doesn't know how, and I go, I know. That's exactly how writing works very often.
When you returned to South Dakota, some of your most intense and personal writing occurred there, and yet other writers have to get away from home. Hemingway couldn't write about where some of his great placement kinds of writing until he was far away from it, both in distance and time, and yet you went right into the core of it. Did that not present a problem?
Well, I think it would have if I had actually grown up in that town. The little town in South Dakota where my mother grew up. I actually live in her house. That her childhood toys are all over the house. It's really wonderful. But if I had actually grown up in that town, I probably couldn't live there and write the way I've done. I might have gone to Chicago or Minneapolis and be writing about that little town. Like Louise Erdrich's, you know, great love medicine. She wrote it when she was in New Hampshire about North Dakota. I mean, it's a marvelous novel. So I think there is that kind of distance. The place I really haven't written about is Honolulu very much, just a tiny bit. That challenge of, you know, where you spent your time growing up It is more difficult, I think, to write about it. Now, Dakota is one of the few books written about that part of the country that's actually written by someone who does live there. We have a lot of books by people who have grown up there and left, or people who have passed through, and sometimes written marvelous books, but they're visitors. They're sort of coming in for a little bit of a time and then going back to New York or whatever and writing about it.
So the distance does matter.
It does matter, and I think both David and I have said the lives we have in western South Dakota wouldn't be possible if we'd actually grown up in that town. I think it's just too confining in some ways for the kind of work we want to do.
You know, as we wrap up this evening's interview, we have some writers, some aspiring writers, some proven writers in the audience. What advice would you give to all those different levels of writers?
I guess just not to lose faith in the process, even when writing seems to have failed you. I guess I'll take an image from the Dakotas that when drought strikes prairie grass, it dies down to the roots. And so what it means is that it looks dead externally. If you look at a clump of native prairie grass, it looks dead. And what happens is the minute any moisture comes, it just springs right back up from the roots and greens again. And I think the rhythm of the writing process, which is some inspiration, some intense writing and painful revision, all of those things. There are some real drought periods as well as nice tropical rains or nice little showers and sometimes thunderstorms. All those things are going to happen, but to sort of have some faith in that process that if you're really in the habit of writing, it will keep after you. You don't really have to do much of anything. And I guess one of my best things, I'll quote William Stafford too, he said, most writer's block just comes because people won't lower their standards. That if you sit long enough, something will come into your mind, and that means that it's something you can work with and use. And I think to a large extent, lowering your standards is very good advice. Now that's just what you wanted to hear, lower your standards.
I didn't know they could get any lower in my own work, but I'll try. Hand me a shovel. Kathleen Norris, I want to thank you for being with us. Thank you. You've been your usual enlightening self. Thank you very much.
Thank you.